In class, we had talked about the importance of Greece's first contact with Egypt around 650 BC, and we can see that quite clearly here in this Kouros figure, which borrows the basic pose directly from Egyptian statuary. This contact with Egypt inspired the Greeks to move to stone funerary sculpture versus the earlier terracotta pots. This contact with with Egypt also radically changed Greek architecture. On making contact with Egypt, the Greeks moved from wood and mud buildings to stone buildings under the influence of their neighbors across the Mediterranean. And that will be the subject of this 10-minute art fix, is the development of Greek architecture in the Archaic period. As a direct sign of the influence of ancient Egypt, we can see, in fact, that if we look back at Egyptian buildings, here's the mortuary precinct of King Zoser, who had the step pyramid that we saw before. You can see that the Greeks have adopted the idea of fluted columns with these vertical bands, as well as the idea of capitals. In ancient Egypt, they were based on papyrus plants, but here they've been schematized. So this shows us how important really the contact with Egypt was also for architecture. It gave birth to stone architecture in Greece. However, for the capitals, instead of using Egyptian capitals, you'll notice that they are a variation on the old Minoan capital type, because these are in fact their direct ancestors. Now, this particular temple is fairly badly damaged on the inside. The columns that you're seeing here were simply an ornamental surrounding for the actual temple itself. Here's a ground plan, and you can see that it sits on a base, and the columns around the sides are simply the decoration on the exterior, and the actual temple itself is the walled interior, which is now lost from this particular building. The columns that appear on the outside make the building symmetrical. You'll notice that it's the same side to side and end to end, identical and symmetrical. And this sort of harmony is the hallmark of Greek architecture. In fact, like most Greek art, we have this interest in ratios between the different parts and trying to find the perfect ratio that establishes a sense of visual harmony. And that's what we're looking at in this art kit. If we look at the elevation, the side view, if you will, of the building, we can see that it's broken up into three basic parts. There's the base down below, there's the column section in the middle, and the area at the top that we call an entablature. You'll also notice that each of these three sections of the building are also split into threes. The base has three steps that you can see here. The column has a shaft, a fluted shaft, as well as a capital up above. And the capital is made of two different parts. There's the square tablet area and the pad underneath it. These are called the echinus, that swelling pad, and the abacus, the tabula on top of it. So it's a three-part column as well. You'll also notice that the columns swell fairly dramatically to the sides. We call this entasis, or they call it an entasis. And this gives it a sense of visual harmony. It helps to make it look straight, but also to make the column look as if it's supporting the weight above it. Finally, at the very top, the entablature up above has three parts as well. There's the part directly on top of the columns, called the architrave. There's the area above that called the frieze, and there's the area above that called the cornice, which would have been here, and in this case is missing. With the cornice, on each of the ends of the temple, there was a triangular extension up above called a pediment. This supported the wooden roof that covered the entire interior temple plus the columns on the outside. On any Greek temple, the only parts of the temple that were decorated with sculpture were above the columns. The pediment area here had sculptures in it, as did the frieze area here, directly beneath it. The idea of filling a pediment with sculpture presented some problems to Greek artists. How do you fill this narrow space, tall in the center but very, very low on the sides? How do you fill this with sculptures in a harmonious way? Right, so the frieze there, you see, right? And our early Greek sculptors made very simple changes. As you can see from this pediment, this is a massive pediment from a building, we have larger figures in the middle and significantly smaller figures down below. This was their solution to the pediment problem. The central figure here you might recognize. This is Medusa, our snake-haired goddess who turns men to stone with her evil stare. She looks out at us grimacingly with those large almond eyes that remind us very much of the Kouros figure that we saw from the Metropolitan Museum. Because she turns unwanted visitors to stone, here on the front of the temple, it's not a temple dedicated to Medusa because she's an evil figure. She here is to protect the temple from unwanted visitors. And you'll notice that she has lions on either side of her as well, something we've seen in a great number of buildings as protective figures. Obviously, she's a direct descendant of our old Minoan snake goddesses, and in fact it was Minoan figures like this one that inspired the myth of Medusa. So early on, the solution to the pediment problem was rather simplistic. Just change the scale of the figures as we get closer to the corners. As we move to the end of the 6th century, around the year 500, we have a much more sophisticated and realistic solution. The pose changes rather than the scale of the figures. And so here we see a figure from the corner of the west pediment of the Temple of Athena at Aegina. And you can see that the artist has manipulated the figure to fit in the space. And all of the other figures are simply in different poses that reflect their situation within the pediment. This is a much more sophisticated and satisfying solution. You'll also notice that the figure is significantly more lifelike. He is bound by gravity. He's fallen down trying to remove an arrow from his chest, supporting himself on his elbow. He's turned out toward us because, of course, we're looking at him from the outside and never from the back. He still has very archaic features, and you'll notice that even though he's dying, he has that archaic smile that we've seen in some sculptures in the past. But notice the complicated pose that he has, with one leg bent over the other. When we looked at vase painting, we saw something very similar, where through the course of the 6th century, poses became much more complex, twisting and turning his face. The same thing here in architectural sculpture. On the opposite side of the same building, we have this figure, who's also in your text. And there you go. Slightly later in the building program, and you can see the figure has become even more realistic. He twists and turns in space rather than leaning up to show us his body. He too is trying to pull an arrow from his side as he supports his weight on his shield. The musculature of the legs, you can see, is much more detailed and really significantly more realistic. And the pose, more sophisticated and complicated. But again, it's part of this solution to the pediment problem. The figures each fit into the corner of one of the two pediments that mirror each other on opposite sides of the building. Also notice that even though he's significantly more realistic, you can see the veins in his arm, he still is wearing that strange, archaic smile that was in the archaic period, the way in which sculptors attempted to give life to their figures. Well, we'll look at more Greek architecture